Howdy y'all, in this video we're going to talk about some strategies for doing logic proofs. We're going to discuss three strategies here and hopefully they will help you in doing these proofs on your own. Alright, so the first strategy is to be mindful of the main connective. So when you're looking at the sentences that make up your argument or the sentences that you have produced on a line, be aware what the main connective is, and the main connective of a sentence is the connective whose scope is the entire sentence. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means with some examples, but it's important to determine what the main connective is in order to determine what kind of sentence that you're dealing with, right? So the main connective tells you kind of what type of sentence it is. So is it a conjunction? Is it a negation? Is it a disjunction or a conditional? And once you kind of know this, then it will help you figure out sort of what sorts of rules could potentially apply to that sentence. So for instance, if you're dealing with a conjunction, um, that the simplification rule is the most obvious choice here because a simplification, or excuse me, the simplification rule allows you to sort of break up a conjunction. So one way to sort of figure out what the main connective sort of actually is to think about the order of operations from the truth table computations, right? So when we were doing truth tables, in order to calculate the value, you had to go through this sort of procedure as to sort of which ones to do first, which logical operation rules you need to use first before you could determine the value of the whole sentence. So the main connective would be the one that you would do last, right? That the main connective at that last computation would tell you what the value of the entire sentence is, and so the main connective is that last one. So we'll move on here with some examples, and this will sort of help you a little bit. Um, so the first thing to kind of think about is you have two kinds of connectives. You have sort of binary connectives, and which are the conditional and the conjunction and the disjunction. And so here's some examples of somewhat complicated sentences where the main connective of these sentences is a binary. So all these negations here, if you think about the order of operations, if you were sort of computing the value of these sentences, you would do those negations first, and you would do the binary connective last. So with each of these sentences, you should sort of understand them as, well, in the case of the first sentence, you should understand that as a conjunction, because the main connective is the and. In the second sentence, the main connective is the arrow, the if-then, and in the third sentence is the or. So all of these sentences are binaries, right? All these sentences, in the case of number one, is a conjunction. In the case of number two, is a disjunction. Excuse me, a conditional, and the last example is a disjunction. Um, so the main connective is for all of them the binary connective, and this is how they would be represented in their sort of simplest form, right? So if you're just kind of focused on sort of the one connective that matters most, this is kind of how you should think about these things, right? So P and Q, P arrow Q, or P or Q, right? Don't worry about the messy stuff here for a little bit. Just try to sort of focus in on what the main connective is. And once you've done that, then you can kind of determine which rules might apply. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But for now, we just want to think about these kind of hard cases. So here's another sort of situation where we have some complicated sentences. We have some stuff in parentheses now, and we have sort of negations as well. But again, if you were doing the computing, the last thing that you would do would be these binaries, right? This conditional here on the left, and this disjunction in the middle, and this conjunction on the right. That the main connective of all these sentences is the binary outside of the parentheses. And again, if you were just to kind of think of just the absolute sort of basic form of these sentences, they would look like this, right? It would be P arrow Q, P or Q, or P and Q. That all that sort of complicated stuff will matter sort of later, but for now, with these sentences, the main connective or the rules that you're going to be using are going to be focused on that binary. So important thing to sort of keep in mind as you go forward. Okay, keeping with our discussion of sort of main connectives, negations. So negations are unary operators. It's the only unary operator that we have, which is to say it only operates on one thing at a time. So a lot of times you see sort of negations that are just sort of negating sort of one letter, which is fine, but if you're in a situation where the negation is in front of the parentheses, and everything else inside of that sentence is in the parentheses other than the negation, then the main connective is a negation, right? So here's some examples of things where everything else other than the outside negation is inside parentheses. And so the way to understand these are as negations, right? So if you see not the case that A and B, or not the case that not A arrow B, or not the case that A or B and C, you should think of that sentence as a negation, right? You should be thinking of that as a not P or a not Q, depending on what your other sentences are saying. But again, the main connective here is what we're looking for, and in this cases or in these cases, every situation is the negation. The negation outside of the parentheses is the main connective. Okay, so one thing to say on the side. Sometimes the complex sentence operates as a simple sentence, and in those situations, the main connective will be ignored. So here's just an example, or a couple of examples, where in example number one, the not A is a negation, right? But with respect to this pattern, this modus ponens pattern that's being used, it is just the P that, and number one, you should understand that as P arrow Q. So number two is going to be P, and number three is going to be Q. And the same thing is happening over here, because number one is P arrow Q. Number two is P, even though it's complicated, and number three is Q. So again, the finding the main connective may not always be telling for sort of what rule you're going to use, but fairly often it is, and so it's important to sort of keep in mind. Okay, so this gets us to our second strategy. The second strategy for doing these proofs is to kind of know what the rules do, and on what types of sentences they work. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the rules that sort of break things apart. And the most simple version of this is something that I've already mentioned, which is simplification. So simplification will take any conjunction, right? And bear in mind what we're talking about is when the main connective is a conjunction. So if the main connective of your sentence is a conjunction, then you can, whatever the conjuncts are, whatever the two things are that are being conjoined, then you can break it apart. You can always break apart simplification into its component parts, right? That's just what simplification does. Um, and furthermore, this is kind of an easy thing because the simplification doesn't require uh, two lines, right? A lot of these rules require two lines in order to work, but simplification just you could just do it on one line. So all you need is conjunction, and you can break it apart. So again, here's an example. Number one is our starting point here. So number one, the main connective is a conjunction. So the stuff on the right is a conjunct. The stuff on the left is a conjunct. The stuff on the right is a conjunct. So simplification just lets you break that apart. And that's how it works. It's a fairly straightforward rule, and so much so that if there's ever a conjunction in your proof, uh, it's a good rule of thumb just to always break it apart. Okay, so there's some other rules that break things apart. Modus ponens, modus tollens, and destructive syllogism break things apart, but they all require two lines to work. So you need the disjunction or the conditional, but you also need some other piece in order to do the breaking apart. Um, so modus ponens and modus tollens are the rules that break apart conditionals. Modus ponens requires the antecedent of the conditional, and it gets you the consequence. So if P then Q, P therefore Q. And modus tollens requires the negation of the consequent, and it gets you the negation of the antecedent. So that's P arrow Q, not Q, therefore not P. Um, but either way, you're sort of breaking things apart. With modus tollens, you introduce a negation, but nevertheless, you're going from a more from a binary sentence to something that's a little less complex. Destructive syllogism, and it's in its name, so that might help you remember. But destructive syllogism breaks apart disjunctions, so any or sentences is what it does, and what it requires in terms of that second line is a negation of one of the disjuncts. So this is the argument by elimination idea. So if it's P or Q and you have not P, well, then you're going to be left with Q. If you have not Q, then you're going to be left with P. So either way, it works, but you require that sort of second line. Okay, so some examples. Modus ponens rule, right? You need the conditional. If you have the antecedent of the conditional, then you can get the consequent. So here's a kind of a complicated conditional, right? The main connective here is the arrow, right? So the not A is going to be our P, the not B is going to be our Q. So not A, the antecedent, right? The P, therefore Q by modus ponens. So modus ponens allows us to break that apart, but it requires the antecedent. Modus tollens, similar kind of situation, but it requires the negation of the consequent. So here's a complicated sentence, right? If A or B, then C. So the main connective here is the arrow again, the conditional. So A or B is the P, C is the Q. So not C will be not Q. And then by the pattern, right, by the modus tollens pattern, you'll get not P, right? Not the case of A or B by modus tollens. So again, we're breaking things apart, right? We had in number one a fairly complicated sentence, and then we used the negation of the consequent to get the negation of the antecedent. All right, the disjunctive syllogism, right? So if you have a disjunction, then you can do argument by elimination. So if you eliminate one of the disjuncts, you can get the other. So here's an example of a pretty complicated sentence. A and B or A or B. And again, the main connective here is the disjunction. And in line 2, we have the negation of the first disjunct, right? So there's not the case at P. And by the pattern, then you can get the second disjunct. So argument by elimination. So if, excuse me, P or Q, not Q, therefore, Q, sorry, not P, therefore Q. So that's how that one works. Again, argument by elimination. So if you have a disjunction, right, that's the or sentence, then if you can eliminate one, that will sort of get you the other. It's not the same as modus tollens, right? Modus tollens says if you have the negation of the consequent, then you'll get the negation of the antecedent. This works sort of slightly differently. Okay, so the other set of rules that we have, the three other rules we have, allow you to build things up. Excuse me, two other rules that we have allow you to build things up. So conjunction and addition are the two rules that we use to create more complex sentences. So the conjunction rule puts two lines together with a conjunction. So take any two lines in your proof, and you can stick them together with the conjunction sign. Addition allows you to add any sentence that you want, even if it's not in the proof, to a line as long as you use the or symbol. So that gives you a lot more freedom. That addition allows you to add whatever, as long as it's a sentence in the language, to an existing line in your proof, and as long as you add it with the or. So bear in mind that with disjunctions with or sentences, only one of them has to be true. So if you have something on the line, we're assuming that that is true. And so if that's true, then that or anything else is going to be true, and thus it's a legal move. So here's an example of conjunction, right? So line 1 is excuse me, not the case of A arrow B. Line 2 is C arrow D. And so with conjunction, we're just going to put those two things together. And I've misnumbered things here, so that should read 1 and 2. So 1 and 2 gets you this big sort of messy thing. So you start with something somewhat more simple, you end up with something more complex. So that's building things up. Here's an example of a couple uses of the addition strategy. So, bear in mind that you can add whatever you want as long as you use an or. So what's going on here is we start with line 1, which is just not A. And then to that, we're going to add not B. Again, we can add whatever we want as long as we use the or symbol. And then to line 2, right, so now we have not A or not B, we're going to add this other sort of complicated thing, which is going to be C arrow D. So just an addition of some more stuff, and it's entirely legal because you're doing the or rule. Okay, so I want to talk about our final strategy is going to be sort of working backwards, and this has to do with any proof, especially if you don't know where to start. You should always look at the conclusion first. So the conclusion of the goal is going to help you kind of see where you need to go, and if you can kind of work backwards a few steps. Hopefully that will kind of open up some doors as to potentially sort of what you need to do first with your proof. So one thing to sort of pay attention to with the conclusion is sort of what kind of sentence the conclusion is. And then you also want to ask sort of where in the premises is the conclusion, or the parts. So if well, we'll talk about this with some examples, but you want to see oftentimes the conclusion is either made up of or broken apart from some of the premises. So you kind of want to see sort of where the conclusion is going to come from, or where the pieces of the conclusion are going to come from. Um, and then what you're going to try to do is from that is to try to come up with some sort of some of the end steps of the proof, right? What is the final step probably going to be? So, for instance, if the conclusion is a simple sentence letter or just sort of a negated sentence, then there's a good chance the final step will be involve breaking something apart. So there's a good chance that you're going to use the simplification rule or modus ponens or modus tollens or disjunctive syllogism as your final step, right? It just depends on kind of where you're going to be pulling that letter out of. It's going to tell you sort of which of those rules that you're going to use. So remember, simplification only works on conjunctions, modus ponens and modus tollens only work on conditionals, and disjunctive syllogism only works on a disjunction. So that's sort of the breaking apart stuff. It's in some other cases you'll there's a good chance that you'll be sort of putting things together. So if the conclusion is a conjunction, well, the final step will probably be conjunction, right? It'll probably mean that you're going to need to get, one conjunct by itself and another conjunct by itself, and you just sort of put it together with the conjunction rule. Furthermore, if the conclusion is a disjunction, and especially if one of the letters doesn't appear anywhere in your proof, right? If one of the sentences in the disjunction is totally novel, then it's a guarantee that the final step will be addition. So again, just by kind of looking at the conclusion, that can kind of tell you what rule you'll be using. And then finally, here's a rule that we haven't sort of discussed yet, and it doesn't get used super often. But if the conclusion is a conditional, then there's a good chance that the final step will be a hypothetical syllogism. Hypothetical syllogism is one of these that doesn't really make things sort of more complex or less complex. It kind of just transforms things because you go from a conditional to a conditional, and it doesn't sort of fit these other ways of thinking. Okay, so the best way to sort of discuss these strategies is to do them put them into practice with some examples. So let's do that. Here I got some examples here on these next two slides, and we'll just go through them while at the same time talking about our strategies. So the first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to do this one on the left. I'm just going to start by talking about sort of what types of sentences we're dealing with. So number one is a conditional. That's the main connective. Number two is a conjunction. That's the main connective. Number three is a conditional. That's the main connective. So in terms of rules that might work on here, we're going to have modus ponens and modus tollens for the for the conditionals. We're going to have simplification for the conjunction, which is number two, right? So simplification just lets us break that apart. And then I'm also going to look at the conclusion, which is over here, right? The conclusion is always next to the three dots. And this tells me what I'm shooting for. And the conclusion is E, which appears in the premises once. It appears in line 3. Sorry, this is made things kind of confusing here. Let me erase things here. So E is here as the consequent of this conditional. So very likely the last step, or what I'm going to try to do to get that E out, is use the modus ponens rule, right? That if I can do P arrow Q and get P, then I'll be able to get Q, which in this case is E. So all I need to do, so my goal here, my intermediate goal is to get that P, right? Which in this case is not A and not D. That will allow me to do the modus ponens rule. So that's what I'm going to shoot for. I'm going to try to get not A. I'm going to try to get not D, and see if I can run the modus ponens rule. Now, not A and not D aren't together anywhere else, so chances are that I'm going to need to manipulate sort of 1 and 2 in various ways in order to get what I want. But this is how it's going to go. So the first thing that you should always do is if you ever have a conjunction, is just to break it apart using your simplification rule. So number 2 is a conjunction, so I can get not B by simplification. So that's, oops, excuse me, I already wrote that. Simplifying line 2 gets me not B. And then also simplifying line 2, I could get the other conjunct, which is C and not D. So that too is a conjunction. So I'm going to split that apart as well. So I'm going to simplify line 5 now and get C. And I'm going to also do it to get not D. So my first round here, I'm just simplifying everything that I can. So I get B by itself. I get not D by itself. I get C by itself. Okay, so I've got not D by itself, which is nice. So if I can get not A, I can conjoin that with not D, and I'll have uh, my modus ponens pattern. So what I'm going to do then is figure out a way to get not A. And I can do that using modus tollens. So if you look at the first premise is a conditional. So if I have the negation of the consequent of that conditional, then I get the negation of the antecedent. That's modus tollens. And I do have the negation of the consequent in line 4, right? That's not B. And so not B along with A arrow B, so lines 1 and 4, via the modus tollens rule, will get me not A. And now what I can do is I can take line 8, which is not A, and add it to line 7, or excuse me, conjoin it with line 7 using the conjunction rule. And what do you know? That is the antecedent of the conditional in line 3, right? So line 3 is not A and not D, arrow E. So here's not A and not D. So by modus ponens, I can get E. And that's with lines 3 and 9. So 3 and 9, modus ponens gets you the conclusion. Okay, so these are pretty complicated things, but in all the situations, I was using my strategies. I started with took a look at the conclusion. I figured out what types of sentences everything was, and I thought about the rules that worked on those sentences. So let's do another one. So here the conclusion. We'll again start by looking at the conclusion. Is a conjunction. So what I can do is, in thinking about how to work backwards here, is I can bear in mind that, well, if I can get C by itself, excuse me, not C by itself, and not D by itself, then my last step will be just to conjoin those two, right? Just to get not C and not D. So how am I going to do that from here? Well, here's D. Is part of this conditional. So I'm probably going to get not D through modus tollens. Here's C as the antecedent of this conditional. So I'm probably going to get not C with modus tollens as well. But in order to do that, I'll need not A and I'll need not B. But lo and behold, look at number 1. Hey, not A and not B in a conjunction. So I'll just break those apart, right? So with conjunctions, you can always simplify. And then you can use those pieces for the other rules. So with not A, I'm going to use that along with the conditional in line 2 to get not C. So that's going to be through modus tollens. And similarly, I'm going to get not D by using not B and the conditional in line 3, so 3 and 5 modus tollens. And then now we're at that place that I talked about at the beginning where we have not C by itself and not D by itself. And so to get the conclusion, we're just going to conjoin those two because that's what conjunction lets us do. It lets us take any two lines and stick them together with an and symbol. And given that that is the conclusion, then we are done with that one. Okay, so we've got two more examples to work through here, and then we'll call it a day for this video. On the left here, we have a conclusion that is a disjunction, so it's an or. And the interesting thing about this particular disjunction is that the second disjunct, the F here, doesn't make an appearance anywhere in the premises. So this F sort of comes out of nowhere. And the only way for something to come out of nowhere is through the addition rule. So the way that this is going to sort of end is I'm going to generate not B, and then once I have that, I can just add F to it. So remember that you can add anything you want to an existing line as long as you use the or operator. So if not B is true, then not B or anything is going to be true. But before we get to that, let's kind of take a look at our premises here. We've got an or, so disjunctive syllogisms work on that. We have an arrow, so modus ponens and modus tollens work on that. And we have a conjunction, so some simplification works on that. And remember, simplification doesn't require any other lines, so we can just do that first. So we'll just simplify line 3 to get its component parts. We'll get sort of D, and we'll get E through the simplification rule. And then we can use that to get some other stuff. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use this D from line 4 along with the conditional from line 2 and do a modus ponens, right? So line 2 is D arrow something. And modus ponens says as well, if you have the antecedent, which we do, which is just D, then you can get the consequent. So the consequent of that conditional is not A and not C. And we did that through modus ponens. So 1 and 4 modus ponens. And now that we have that, that line 6 is a conjunction, right? The main connective is the and here, so we can use simplification on that. So we'll simplify line 6 to get not A, and we'll do it again to get not C. And we need those. So the not A is going to help us break apart line 1. So line 1 is a disjunct, right? So A or B arrow C. And so argument by elimination, if we have not A, well, that will get us B arrow C through disjunctive syllogism. So that's, let's see, number 1 and number 7 fit the disjunctive syllogism pattern. And then from that, now I have B arrow C. I can use this not C in line 8 to get not B using the modus tollens pattern. So we have 8 and 9 modus tollens. And now we're at that last step. I have not B, so I'm going to add F. So not B is line 10. I'm going to add F to it, and that is the conclusion. Okay, moving on. Our final example here, we have an argument where I'm going to make the final step a hypothetical syllogism. So it's the one rule we didn't really talk about, but the hypothetical syllogism pattern doesn't really break things apart, doesn't really make things more complicated. It just takes two conditionals and turns them into one. So you get P arrow Q if you, on one line. If you have Q arrow R on the other line, then you can get B arrow D. And if you look at lines 1 and 2, you'll see that that's that pattern over here, right? So here's B arrow C, here's C arrow D. So if you do hypothetical syllogism on it, we'd get B arrow D. But the trick is we'd have to get those on their own, right? That this sentence right now is a disjunction, right? And so the only thing that we can use on it is disjunctive syllogism. Oh, there's a mistake here. There should be an and. So this should be not A and not B, otherwise we can't do anything. And that will allow us to use the simplification rule. So assuming that this is an and not an or in line 3, we can get not A through simplification, and we can get not B through simplification. Yeah, it definitely has to be a conjunction in order to work. So now we've got not A and not B, and we can use both of these to do disjunctive syllogism patterns on 1 and 2. So if you take 1 and 4 together, you can do argument by elimination and get B arrow C, right? So that's 1 and 4 disjunctive syllogism. And if you take 2 and 5 together, so not B and B or C arrow D, you get C arrow D. And now I can do that hypothetical syllogism rule. So I've got B arrow C, I've got C arrow D. That gets me B arrow D through hypothetical syllogism. So lines 6 and 7 fit that hypothetical syllogism pattern. And that is that. So we have the conclusion, and our proof is complete. So I hope this helps. We'll discuss more in class. Any questions that you have about these things, but hopefully this gives you more of a sense of what's going on with proofs. All right, thank you.